Welcome to Illinois International, bringing the world to your living room. Produced through the University of Illinois' Department of International Programs and Studies.
You're watching Illinois International, a program featuring Illinois faculty, visiting scholars, and diplomatic guests who share their insights on world affairs and international trends. I'm Nicole Tami, your host. My guest today is Adrienne Lo, Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her work draws on discourse analysis, linguistic anthropology, applied linguistics, and education. Lo's recent research examines the experiences of South Korean returnees from study abroad, media representation of Korean Americans in the South Korean popular media, and the historical racialization of Asian American language ability. She also co-directs the American University Meets the Pacific Century Project, a research initiative that examines the internationalization of the undergraduate student body at the University of Illinois. Welcome to the show. In your project, you define the American University as a contact zone in which international undergraduates, largely from Asia, meet American students whose futures are increasingly impacted by global transformations. A few years ago, I spoke with a colleague of yours, Nancy Abelman, who's also a co-director of the project. And I'd like to know how the project has grown and changed in these last few years, and perhaps how the data that you've collected has begun to shift the questions that you're currently asking.
Yes, so we started our project about almost 4 years ago at this point. In recent years, we've really seen a growth and a kind of maturation in the international student population here at the U of I. So we've seen a lot more media being presented by Chinese international students. We've seen more RSOs trying to build bridges between Asian Americans and international students, and I would say those are probably the most recent developments that we've seen.
Can you maybe briefly describe for us what your primary research areas are in this ethnographic project?
Okay, so I would say that it's a project, first of all, that's co-directed by 4 faculty. So there's me and Nancy Abelman. We're both in anthropology. Nancy's also in East Asian Studies, Languages and Cultures. Suwa Kwan, who's in Asian American Studies and Human Community Development, and also Tim Liao, who's in Sociology. And we're really looking at kind of 3 main questions in our project. The first question is how the rise in international undergraduate students is changing the dynamics of race on our campus. The second is how it might be impacting how undergraduates are thinking about their transnational and global futures. And the third is how it is playing into the politics of the globalization and commodification of higher education. So we have teams of student researchers. These include undergraduates, graduate students, and postdocs. They each go out and do ethnographic research on a specific part of the campus. We've also run a survey, that's what Professor Liao is in charge of, gathering data on the international students here on campus. We're trying to look kind of really broadly across the whole campus. I would say that we're trying to look at how faculty are responding, how staff and administrators, how student services, kind of at the campus level. We're also looking specifically at kind of 4 student populations. So those would be international students themselves, international undergraduates, domestic students who are white, domestic students who are Asian American, and then domestic students who are people of color who are not Asian American, so African American and Latino students. So those are kind of the populations we're focusing on.
And so you have undergraduate students from all of these ethnic categories that are participating in the project, correct?
Yeah, we've got undergraduates, some of them are majoring in anthropology, some of them are from East Asian Languages and Cultures, some of them are sociology majors, and they all do kind of their own little part of the project.
Have you done any benchmarking in terms of how the University of Illinois compares with other maybe CIC schools or Big Ten institutions who also have large populations of international students?
We haven't done any specific benchmarking. We have spoken with colleagues at Purdue. They also have a large international population. They've also run the survey that we've run. at the same thing, but I would say, as far as I know, we're the only kind of ethnographic group doing this work at this moment. There's also a project that's starting up at Michigan State University. They have a large population as well.
Speaking of surveys, we've actually conducted a number of surveys aside from the one that you're doing on your project, including the International Student Barometer, which data seems to indicate that the overall satisfaction rate among international students at Illinois is fairly high in many capacities. What does your ethnographic data tell us about the Illinois experience, and what can we and other institutions perhaps in the United States do to improve the experience of international students based on the data that you're finding?
Okay. Yes, I would say our data is pretty much in agreement with the survey data coming out, that most students are pretty happy with what they're getting at the University of Illinois. There are some areas of concern that students have talked to us about. One of the major ones has to do with making friends. So some of them find it's very difficult to make friends here with students who aren't also international students. And that's one area that I know the campus has really been kind of focusing on.
Right. So we have a number of new positions, including the work that I'm doing currently, that's trying to focus on aspects of integration and starting to ask questions like, what does integration mean? And, you know, from assimilation to inclusion, sort of what are the ideas? And in my experience, I've come to believe that integration is a very personal thing. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the different conceptions that students have when they talk about issues surrounding integration?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I would say that our students have very different ideas about what internationalization might mean to them. I think for some students, they're very content just to kind of come here and get a degree and then go home. And they don't really understand why the university is forcing them to try to make friends with other people. They feel that that's not the point of being here. They feel the point of being here is to attend a great university, and that's what they're doing. Other students, however, really do feel like they do want to kind of become more integrated into American society and to make more friends. So we're seeing we're seeing some differences in kind of how people think about their experiences here, which partly relates to how they think about their lives after school, of course, whether they plan to stay here or whether they plan to return or move somewhere else.
Do you think there's a disconnect, particularly among our undergraduate students, to some degree when it comes to the relationship between social friendships and networks and future professional opportunities in terms of what we do when we start to connect with people socially and what sorts of doors or opportunities that may open up post-graduation?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the reason that it depends partly is some of the students tell us that they plan to go back to China to get jobs, in which case actually it's not that important for them just from a professional level to be networking with other students here. I would say that for some students, though, that's not their primary concern. I mean, they actually do want what some people have called the liberal college experience, the idea where you make friends with people who are different than you, and that's how you grow, and that's really something that they're seeking here.
We have seen, when I've spoken with colleagues around campus, an increase of international students attending services provided by the Career Center, for example, or even our Leadership Center. And a lot of that, because there are certain professional incentives, I guess, such as a certificate or other sort of tangible accolades that you can get from participating, that those programs have had more success than some of the maybe more student service oriented that don't have as tangible of maybe an outcome or a carrot. And so I'm also wondering, is that a general sort of issue that our undergraduates deal with in terms of what is the payoff for me, and not being able to recognize potentially some of the payoffs of not necessarily integration, but just that experience of connecting with someone who is outside of your normal social network?
Yeah, we do find that the sort of professional certificate programs are very well attended. I mean, if they can get a credential or a certificate, you know, that tends to make them want to go to them. I'm not sure. I mean, I would say the desire to kind of make friends outside of the people who you know is really pretty varied among the students that we've talked to. Some students really feel it's a complete waste of time to come here if you don't make friends. That's the whole purpose of studying in the US. Otherwise, they could just be studying in Korea. And they feel that Koreans who only hang out with other Koreans are really wasting their time and money here. And other people really don't see it that way. I mean, they see that, you know, there's no problem. If I just want to hang out with all Chinese students, then that should be fine, and I'm getting a great education anyhow.
For those students who do want to connect cross-culturally, how much do you think, you know, from an anthropological perspective, that culture has, ideas about friendship, ideas about collegiality, ideas or definitions about a classmate, and how those are defined, and the sorts of preconceived definitions and ideas that students have, both from the domestic end and from, the international student end, about what those mean may be impeding some of those possibilities to connect.
That's a really good question, and I would say that there are definitely cross-cultural differences. I mean, just from the example, actually, that you spoke to me about once, of a student who wanted to borrow his roommate's textbook, and his roommate said, "Well, I can sell that textbook. Why should I lend it to you?" And the Chinese student was really taken aback, because to him, sort of the borrowing of the textbook was a gesture of friendship. It was sort of a way that they would become closer. It was a gesture that they were supposed to be, intimate with one another. And from the domestic student's perspective, why should I sell you this thing? Why should I give you this thing when I can sell it for $100? So I think there are definitely cross-cultural differences in terms of how people, interpret different gestures of friendship and things like that. I mean, one thing we have heard from our international students is they are some of them are very taken aback by the American, form of sociality called the party, and they don't quite understand why it's fun to stand around in a room that's really loud with a bunch of people all getting drunk, and they see this as a very peculiarly American way of socializing that really doesn't say much to them, or that they're not terribly interested in participating in.
So that may also feel alienating in terms of the party culture,
Right.
which is a very perhaps popular, but also stereotypical sort of aspect of college culture in the US.
Right.
A significant number of Korean students have pre-college study abroad experience in the United States, and sometimes in places like Australia or England. How does this shape or impact their experience once they come to the University of Illinois?
That's a great question. That's probably the biggest difference that we find among our international students, is those who have had experience in the US and those who haven't. So I would say that for our two biggest populations, the South Korean students, almost all of them have had some kind of study abroad experience prior to coming to the U of I for college. For some, that might be a decades-long spell in the US, all the way through high school. For some, that might have been just 2 years when they were young. It's really very varied. But I think now in South Korea, this idea that one should go abroad to study, at least for part of your education, before college is really entrenched, not just for very wealthy people, but even among sort of average middle-class people. So I think for those students, they're much more familiar with kind of English language education. They have much stronger, in some cases, receptive language skills, certainly ability to follow a lecture, things like that. They're generally more familiar. It's not as much of a culture shock, for them to come here because they spent time here. I think our Chinese students are really very different. For many of them, this is their first experience. Studying abroad, being away from their family and all of that. So I think there is a bit more of a culture shock on that side.
So from what I hear you saying is that perhaps for our South Korean students, it may be easier to find those entry points if they are interested in sort of connecting with domestic students or with students who come from other countries around the world.
Yeah, to some degree. They probably have more cultural familiarity and those kinds of things. Yeah, they've probably made friends in high school. It probably is a little bit easier for them.
One of the things we are trying to generate, because I think many of us at the university do see the value in these cross-cultural interactions, be they in the classroom or outside in a social setting, are identifying entry points that are meaningful, that aren't necessarily forced or contrived, which I think students tend to veer away from. Have you gotten feedback from students about either programs or situations that were helpful or successful for them to find some of these entry points?
Yeah, I mean, one thing we hear from a lot of our students is they would love to learn more about American culture. They would love to take American history here, for example. But for many of them who try to take the lower division American history classes, they find that they're just way too hard. They find that they kind of presume, that you've had American history before in high school, that you're very familiar with it, that you don't need to be introduced to the US Constitution or the War of 1812 or things like this. They also find that the level of reading required in some of our classes is beyond what they're able to accomplish, at least in their first few years at the university. By the end, they're able to read that much, but they find courses that demand that, 100 pages or sometimes more a week. is really far beyond what they've been required to read in English before. So that's a struggle for them.
So it presumes a foundational knowledge in American history, basically.
Yeah, right.
And we'd have to reconceive our History 101 courses or have sections that are specific to students who didn't grow up in the United States and may have learned world history from a very different perspective.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that some of the faculty on the campus are doing that. For example, the Center for East Asian Pacific Studies, CEPS, has been very active in kind of running workshops and things for faculty on how to do that. And they've had very productive conversations about what it's like to teach students, you know, an introductory to East Asia class in which there are students you know, from China and Japan who have been taught, you know, not to necessarily get along with one another by their countries, and kind of dealing with these different kinds of personalities and conflicts in the class. They said, I think there are areas on campus where those kinds of conversations are happening.
You raise an interesting point, because I think for many Americans, myself included, we have a fairly limited knowledge of East Asian cultures, and often East Asian students are lumped together as one homogeneous group by American students or perhaps even by instructors. How do students from Korea, China, or Japan even contend with what must feel like a pretty limited understanding, or maybe even a generification of Asian culture the way we may define it here in the United States, which I suspect is quite different if you're Korean or Chinese?
Right, right. Well, I would say that is one of the things that they have to grapple with here. For many of them, it's the first time. It might be the first time they've left their country. It might be the first time they're actually talking to people who are not, let's say, Chinese. So that is a big part of the Illinois experience for them, is kind of coming to terms with that. Not only coming to terms with being understood, let's say, as Asian, so necessarily having some kind of connection with other people who are Chinese and Korean or Japanese, but also sometimes being racialized as Asian and supposedly having something in common with Asian Americans. So for many of the students that we talk to, their relationship with Asian Americans is very fraught. Asian Americans are sometimes the people they feel closest to, but sometimes they can be the people with whom it's most difficult to kind of have relations.
Is that because there's this presumption that you should have something in common?
Yes, right.
And then realizing that culturally you're much more different than
Yes,
than
exactly.
you might have. Okay, that's interesting. Are there also language barriers that come into play in terms of Asian Americans and their competency, perhaps in the language that their parents or grandparents spoke versus the language that our international students are speaking?
Yeah, I mean, that is an issue. In terms of how the different student groups interact, I mean, generally most of the Asian American groups tend to have their meetings in English, their websites tend to be in English, and the international student groups, you know, don't. I mean, their websites are not in English. So sometimes there can be some tensions around that as well.
Do you feel like there's pushback on the part of domestic students in general when they see an organization like the Chinese Student and Scholar Association or the Korean Student Organization, and they're using their native language in terms of when we talk about things like entry points? It's difficult to collaborate when you click on a website and you find, you know, that it's all in Mandarin, for example. Have you, as you interview sort of the domestic student population, or perhaps even talk to faculty and staff who are working with international students, do you find that that's a point of tension, or?
So I would say that we found pretty different views on how domestic students understand this international student population. For some domestic students, the fact that the U of I has what is now the second largest population of international undergraduates in the country is really a sign of its excellence. They're saying we're getting the best students, not just from Illinois and from the US, but really from the globe. And this is a great sign of Illinois' excellence, and the fact that these students are here is going to help me grow as a global citizen, and that's wonderful. Other domestic students we've had have had slightly different ideas. Some of them have told us that they think that these students are kind of taking away resources that really belong to Illinois, you know, citizens, that this is the University of Illinois, right? And that they also are a bit dismayed kind of they see these students more as threats than kind of as assets. So I would say we see a variety of opinions on that.
So the economic factor of international students on our campus is a touchy one, but I think it would be naive to say that there's not an economic incentive for the University of Illinois and institutions around the country to host international students simply because they bring in revenue, not just for the university, but the larger community. Is that something that international students are fairly aware about in terms of what they're bringing?
So I would say that from the university's perspective, it's really the growth in out-of-state students. So there has been a large rise in international undergraduates, but at the same time, there's been a large rise in the numbers that we see coming from domestic students who are out of state. So students from California, from Massachusetts, I mean from other parts of the US, because they also pay more tuition. And I think that's partly just a response of many of our public state universities to the decreases in state funding that we've had over the past, decade especially. So, this is something that's going on across the U.S. It's not just at the U of I. And I would say that international students are aware that they are paying more. They certainly see that. But they also see the U of I as a great bargain. I mean, when they compare it to tuition costs, let's say, at a private university, they see that they can really get a world-class education here, but for a fraction of the cost.
Much of Asia is, at least from an American perspective, in some ways seen as importing higher education from the U.S. and other Western countries. Do you believe that this trend will continue? And if so, how long?
It's a good question. I guess I can speak most directly to South Korea. That's the area where I've done a little bit of research. And I would say in South Korea there is definitely a trend towards, as you said, importing Western education. So South Korea has decided to allow various foreign educational institutions to set up schools within South Korea that South Koreans can attend. They've really been pushing these kind of global partnerships between South Korean universities and universities in the US and UK and places like that. And yeah, that trend only seems to be accelerating. I think the globalization of higher education is probably here to stay.
So having grappled with these questions and spoken to all kinds of stakeholders in this question of internationalization and the presence of international students on campus, what are some of the most sort of salient or meaningful things that have come out of this project for you?
So I think this project has really made me realize that international students are a wonderful asset for the University of Illinois, and that we could be doing a lot more in the classroom, really to draw upon their experiences and to kind of bridge the divide between international undergraduate students and domestic graduate students in productive ways. We could have, Chinese classes in which domestic students who were learning Chinese were reading about Chinese film in English alongside international undergraduates with a Chinese background, and then they could be working together, sort of, reading literature, scholarly literature in each other's language about the movies. And I think that courses like that, I think being more creative about how we think about integrating them into our teaching is something that the U of I really could work on. I mean, just personally for me, it's made me think a lot about how my teaching is very much geared towards domestic undergraduates. When I think about the examples that I use in the classroom to illustrate things, they're really for someone who's familiar with American popular culture. So it's been hard for me even to think about how to work outside of that. I mean, how to make the material also accessible to someone who might not have gone to high school here.
So it sounds like successful integration, at least in the classroom, really does require a certain level of creativity and also maybe an ability to kind of transform the way that an instructor teaches a particular subject, or bringing in examples that are going to be salient not just for a domestic audience but for an international audience. I guess from a point of view as someone who's sort of pushing that, I always think, what sort of incentives can we give instructors to make that happen, right? Is that something that as an institution we should potentially tie to promotion and tenure, right? In a way to get, because you're always going to have those instructors who think about it and who are creative and who are going to put in the energy to update their courses based on the changing demographic, and then those folks who are so busy doing what they do who may not be willing to put in that time and energy. So I guess part of the question is how do we bring people to the table and get them to understand that need, or as you said, the benefit of having that sort of interaction, and what does that require of an instructor in order to make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, it would be great just for us to have sort of workshops to talk about it, or sort of venues in which that's a possibility. And I think we're starting to have those here. I mean, I think that, again, the CEAPS, the Center for East Asian Pacific Studies, has started to have some of these kind of open dialogues, and they've been incredibly productive and well attended, the ones that we've had. But it would be great to broaden those across the rest of the campus and kind of college by college kind of work through some of these issues.
We do, of course, also have the Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning that is has thought about these issues and is starting to think about it more. So thank you so much. We've run out of time. It was great having you.
It was great.
And if our viewers at home are interested in resources regarding this issue, please visit the website below and join us next time for Illinois International.